Welcome to Inside Academia, the weekly program where we take a look behind the ivory curtain seeking a frank discussion of American education. I'm your host, Andy Nash. My host this week is Jane Shaw. She's president of the John William Pope Center for Higher Education Policy, which is a non-for-profit institute dedicated to improving higher education in North Carolina and in the nation. Jane Shaw, welcome to Inside Academia.
Thank you.
I would like to speak to you today about a recent column that you published on your website, popecenter.org. It had to do with the Association of Core Texts and Courses conference that you attended recently. Apparently this is an annual conference that scholars, mostly liberal arts faculty from around the country and universities attend every year, in which they discuss the what they call the great works or the core texts curricula that they use for their classes. What were your initial impressions this year at the conference?
I always like the conference. I've been there actually for 4 years, and I am very much struck by two things. One is that the people who are there are faculty who really want to teach. They love their students. And they also love the great books. They love the books, the essays, the plays, all of that whole history of literature that we consider our legacy, really. And so the combination is quite wonderful. Sometimes these faculty members are teaching very rudimentary students. They're students who are not necessarily the very best, but there is usually a course called a core texts course, or sometimes called core curriculum, and that's what they are teaching. They are trying to introduce students to the great works of the past.
In your opinion, dealing with so many educators and so many faculty members and scholars, has there been a general complaint among many scholars and faculty of the caliber and quality of college student in that they seem to be reading less or any more or just as much of many of the great classics or the great works as a college-educated person would have been expected to do, say, decades ago?
Yes, well, you have really now kind of mass education of college students, so you have a very great range of abilities, and you have students coming in who in many cases really have hardly read some books, as well as students who are extremely well versed in literature themselves. So you have such a wide variety that's very difficult for faculty to handle. So
is there I guess a crisis, if you will, in great text or core text literature in the classics and the great works among liberal arts?
There is, Andy, but it's actually coming from a different direction. Okay. The crisis, I think, is that so many faculty members are not teaching those great books. They're not teaching the Shakespeares. They're not teaching Plato and Aristotle, except in very specialized ways. There's been a revulsion against the great works of what's called Western civilization in the academy, in the liberal arts. So you have a combination now of kids who really aren't very well prepared, but worse than that, there are so many faculty members who have rejected all of these great writings of the past.
And why is that?
Well, there may be a number of reasons. I know Ralph McInerney, the scholar of Notre Dame who died fairly recently, said that he thought it was because there's most of the literature of the past has some religious element. It's Christian. Most of what we have, Shakespeare appears to be Christian. And even, he said, the Greek classics had a sense of destiny or a sense of a divine order. And the academy today has essentially rejected that. So there's no interest in literature. Another commentator on this was Robert Young of North Carolina State, who said actually most of many of the professors in English these days hate literature. Their goal is to tear it apart or to show what's wrong with it.
To deconstruct it, as it were.
Yes, literally to deconstruct, I guess, which is a technique. But the motivation for that comes from they don't want it. They don't like what it says. They don't like the content.
So, I mean, I guess the question is then, is their approach to not teach it, or is it to just show why they think it's bad?
Well, all of those are occurring. English departments have kind of fallen apart, in terms of, I'm old enough to remember that there was a freshman English course that not only was supposed to teach you to write, but it was supposed to introduce you to some poetry, some theater, some plays, and you were sort of to become aware of what English literature was all about if you hadn't done that already in high school. And today, freshman composition is almost, it's very weird. We wrote an article not too long ago by a young woman who was at UNC Chapel Hill, and basically her freshman composition course was blogging. It was journaling. It was writing about what she felt. There was one small amount of time devoted to reading some rather esoteric essays, but there wasn't the kind of literature or even writing that we think should be occurring in freshman comm.
So, over the years, I've observed personally, and I've heard from many others, that typically what you have, to address your first point about deconstruction, you'll have a small percentage of students who are of the radical persuasion, if you will, who gravitate towards a very strict, deconstructionist version of any of the great Western classics. And they're usually supplanted by some contemporary, postmodern type of sociological explanation for one thing or another. And then the vast majority of students who otherwise take, let's say, courses to fulfill requirements in humanities, liberal arts, or whatnot, even if they are liberal arts majors, they are typically kind of float by. They don't know what they're doing. They don't know why they're there. And they're looking for minimalism with which to essentially go through the motions, if you will, get their ticket punched and graduate. And they end up not getting a core curriculum because they're not forced or expected to really read everything that they're supposed to, and they're largely apathetic, and they don't have an opinion too much one way or another.
Well, I think you did leave out the really good students. There are some very good students who are interested in learning and who don't choose their courses on the basis of how many A's that professor is known to give. You can go to a website and find that out. It's really very sad. But probably I should get back actually to the discussion of the ACTC meeting that I attended, which is really the opposite of what we've been talking about. It's where that group of people who are currently teaching core curriculum, meaning courses typically where the emphasis is on reading the actual books or reading the actual essays, not reading a textbook, not reading what somebody else thinks about it, but actually reading it. That's where some real education is going on. And unfortunately, it's only at a few schools. This was their biggest meeting ever, and it was 420 people attending, which is very good, but that can only represent, in fact, I can't remember how many schools were represented, but probably more like 100. And there are 5,000 schools, post-secondary schools in the United States. So that's part of the problem, that there are only, this is a remnant, this is a dying breed in a way.
So to the faculty who attend that conference every year, are they mostly faculty of, let's say, really good private schools where they typically get really good quality students who are there because they really truly want to be and they wish to learn the great classics? Or are they faculty, rank and file faculty from many universities coming from the phenomenon of mass higher education who are dealing with the problems of trying to get their students just to learn the basics, and they fear that if they burden them with too much reading, they'll get poor evaluations, and then these adjuncts will end up losing their jobs?
Well, I think there's all of that. The schools that have done the best job of maintaining some kind of requirement to actually read some of the historical literature are Catholic schools, traditional Catholic schools, and of course they come in all sizes and all qualities. But Notre Dame is usually represented at ACTC. There are some of the really considered top schools, such as Yale. Yale was a sponsor this year, but it was not a sponsor as the whole university, but rather a segment of it called the Directed Studies program. And that program has maybe 125 freshmen, I think. So compared to all of Yale, it's not a whole lot of people. On the other hand, that obviously would be a very demanding course. In fact, it's known to be very demanding. And then there are state schools. A lot of state schools, not necessarily the flagship schools, but the smaller, maybe commuter colleges, HBCUs, smaller colleges where there is for some reason, a tradition of these initial classes, typically in the freshman and sophomore level, in which a whole variety of serious works are being read. Mm-hmm. And that poses a big challenge sometimes because the students at your run-of-the-mill college aren't necessarily into reading Shakespeare or Jane Austen.
It's interesting because, today with the internet, you can go online and you can find out where all the great works are. And anything in the public domain you can read. You could have always gone into a public library, but now with the internet, it's so much more easily accessible. And then, conversely, we have so many people that go to college that don't read because they're not forced to, they're not asked to, and they don't want to. And so the question in my mind comes almost, what is the purpose of the academy anymore? The people that truly seek it out and want to learn it very easily can and would or do. What about the people that go to college and who get credentialed but don't end up reading?
Well, you've touched on a lot of issues there. You're really asking, what is the value? What is the educational value of a degree these days? And it can vary a great deal. But again, I think there always are going to be some good students. But what happens is the very top students end up in academia themselves. They often have very specialized interests, maybe some rather strange interests, but they then want to teach their special courses in some esoteric subject that they've identified or written a dissertation on. Mm-hmm. And the average student really needs some guidance. I should mention David Clemens is a professor or an instructor perhaps, I'm not sure what the terminology is, at a community college in California. And he has a wonderful course that is how to read the great books. He's bringing in students who maybe never experienced this, had minimal reading. He discusses them, sort of the history of Western literature to a certain extent and how you read, and then he finally brings them up at the end of the semester to read Billy Budd, which is Herman Melville's short novella. And it's a great idea. It's a great idea because these kids often need it.
Yeah, let me end with a question here I want to ask you about something you brought up in your article. It says here that you can attest that the ACTC is suspicious of formal coalitions with conservative groups. Previously in the article you mentioned organizations like the Pope Center and the National Association of Scholars and American Council of Trustees and Alumni. But you say that the ACTC is suspicious of formal coalitions with conservative groups or any group that has what might be viewed as a right-wing ideology in the greater, broader culture wars, but it wasn't as delicate with the leftist Great Books Foundation, heirs of the University of Chicago's Great Books movement. Could you explain that? Why does the ACTC tiptoe delicately with conservative groups in academia and not so much with the left-leaning ones?
Okay, well, maybe before I say that, I'd like to point out that in part the purpose of writing the article, as I did, was to bring in the conservative groups, because I think they have maybe been maybe a little more at fault here. They have ignored this organization, whereas this organization, while it has not welcomed conservatives as conservatives, it welcomes anybody who's interested in the great books and will come in and it is very eager to have them just be participants. So it's really a kind of a two-way street here, right. But they started out, I think, very maybe a little bit timid in the academy, because there have been these culture wars in which if you say something good about Jane Austen, there's something racist or sexist about you, I guess. Maybe not that, but in any case, the academy is so filled with this warring culture that they were very, very careful. They didn't want to be called great books. They wanted to call their organization Core Texts, and they expanded it. And of course, all core texts do not necessarily have to represent Western civilization. They've done a lot, actually, with trying to make us better informed generally about Chinese classics. So they have taken a very broad viewpoint, but that's largely because they are in the academy, and otherwise they would never have gotten anywhere. At least that's my interpretation.
Okay. Very good. Well, I'd like to talk to you again about this, Ms. Shaw, and see where it goes, and hopefully the core text will be increased, both in terms of the amount of reading students do, as well as what scholars will use to familiarize students with the great works. But that's all the time we have for now. Ms. Jane Shaw, I want to thank you again for joining us today. This has been Inside Academia with yours truly, Andy Nash. Check us out on the web at InsideAcademia.tv. Join us again next week, as every week, as we take you for a look behind the ivory curtain.